the main point of the response is to fight back on attempts to define sex as gender in the UN. But let's get into some more detail. Last May, Women's Declaration International called on the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights to protect women and girls globally on the basis of sex by refraining from approving the Report on Gender Theory by Victor Madrigal-Borloz, independent expert for protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity at the United Nations. We argue that the independent expert must give space and consideration to women's concerns and the potential erosion of women's rights. In his report, which came out last summer, he has done the opposite. The first and second parts of the report submitted to the United Nations Human Rights Council in June and July 2021 are called The Law of Inclusion and Practices of Exclusion. Part 1 of the report presents incorporating gender identity in legislation as purely positive and legitimate, whereas Part 2 of his report presents any defense of sex-based rights as negative and exclusionary. To us, it seems that the report seems to be designed to advance the incorporation of the nebulous and shifting concept of gender identity within international law without proper scrutiny and critical examination. We believe this is done in a manner that violates the fundamental human rights of women and girls as a female sex class. In much of what is written in the 3 different documents that can be accessed, Part 1, Part 2, and then also a kind of an easy to read summary. The independent expert tends to contradict himself, claiming that gender as a concept that has evolved in his report from a social construct to an identity, and finally to what he calls a suprabiological phenomenon, whatever that might mean, will not curtail any achievements in equality between the sexes, while at the same time reifying immaterial gender identity as more important than physical sex, for example, in sports. And he does this expressly. The zeal in presenting the reification of gender identities in different societies as a very positive development takes him as far as to state that the categories of male and female are a consequence of colonialism. Quote, to quote his report, the evidence suggests that in many countries, the rigid understanding of the binary of male and female as a main ordering social principle are the result of colonialism. The idea, we argue, that, and write in our statement, that the idea that only the Western world observes the sex binary is, in short, quite patronizing and insulting. I must add that the WDI statement was a joint collaborative text of 4 women to get all together from the legal committee, but it's just the 2 of us who are presenting it, not to take full credit of everything. The independent expert himself even contradicts his own assertions. Throughout, he considers gender as socially constructed under many different formulations, but also innate as an identity or an inner feeling. We argue that it is unacceptable that a report that in its very premise makes directly contradictory claims is taken seriously.